Marcus Chen's alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m., but he was already awake, his mind racing with thoughts about the biggest meeting of his career. In just 6 hours, he would be presenting his company's groundbreaking software to Silicon Valley's top investors, a deal that could change everything. As the 32-year-old CEO of TechFlow Solutions grabbed his carefully packed carry-on bag, he caught his reflection in the mirror. His mother's voice echoed in his head. "Success isn't about how you dress." He smiled, adjusting his favorite gray hoodie over a simple black t-shirt. The sunrise painted the sky in soft oranges as his Uber pulled up to Terminal B. Marcus had flown this route dozens of times, but today felt different. His company had grown from a tiny startup in his garage to a 200-employee operation in just 3 years. This investment meeting could help them reach millions of new users. He double-checked his boarding pass. Seat 2A, first class, a small luxury he allowed himself after years of flying economy. The airport was starting to buzz with early morning travelers as Marcus breezed through security. He perfected his routine. Laptop in one bin, shoes in another, hoodie folded neatly on top. A group of suited executives rushed past him, their leather briefcases swinging. Marcus smiled to himself, remembering how his father had insisted he should dress like a CEO. But Marcus believed actions spoke louder than designer suits. Boarding began right on schedule. As Marcus walked down the jet bridge, he mentally rehearsed his presentation. His latest software could help small businesses compete with industry giants. He just needed to convince the investors. His hand brushed against the small flash drive in his pocket, containing 3 years of hard work and dreams. The first-class cabin welcomed him with its familiar leather seats and soft lighting. Marcus stored his bag, settled into 2A, and pulled out his tablet. The presentation needed one final review. Other passengers filtered in. A woman in a power suit, an elderly gentleman reading the Financial Times, a young family with quietly excited children heading to Disneyland. Flight attendant Sarah Wilson was already working the cabin, offering pre-flight drinks with practiced efficiency. Marcus noticed her warm smiles to other first-class passengers, but when their eyes met, something shifted in her expression. She looked him up and down, her smile fading to a tight-lipped assessment. Marcus had seen that look before, the unspoken question of whether he belonged. He pulled up his boarding pass on his phone, ready for the question he knew was coming. 3 rows behind him, a passenger in an expensive suit was already enjoying his orange juice, no questions asked. Marcus took a deep breath and opened his presentation slides, determined to stay focused on what mattered. The cabin crew bustled around, preparing for departure, but Sarah kept glancing his way. Each looked more suspicious than the last. As the final passengers boarded, Marcus noticed his throat was dry. The air conditioning in first class was always too strong, and he'd been too busy reviewing his notes to grab water at the terminal. He caught Sarah's eye as she passed, raising his hand slightly. "Excuse me, could I get some water, please?" Her response would set in motion a chain of events that neither of them could have predicted, on a morning that would change both their lives forever. The other passengers had no idea they were about to witness something that would make headlines across the country, all starting with a simple request for a glass of water. Sarah Wilson's response to Marcus's simple request for water came with a chill colder than the airplane's air conditioning. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin?" she asked loudly, her voice carrying across the first-class section. Several passengers looked up from their phones and magazines, curiosity mixing with discomfort in their expressions. Marcus had rehearsed this moment in his head countless times before, not for this flight, but for all the moments in his life when others questioned his presence. With the same patience he used to explain complex technology to investors, he reached for his phone. "Yes, I am. Here's my boarding pass. Seat 2A. His voice remained steady, professional, though his heart rate picked up slightly. Sarah squinted at his phone screen, then pulled out a printed passenger list, making a show of double-checking it. A young girl in row 4 whispered something to her mother, who quickly shushed her. The businessman across the aisle pretended to be deeply absorbed in his newspaper, but his eyes weren't moving across the pages. "I'll need to see your ID as well," Sarah announced, even louder than before. The elderly gentleman with the Financial Times lowered his paper, frowning not at Marcus, but at Sarah. Nobody else had been asked for identification after boarding. Marcus noticed a younger flight attendant at the back of the cabin shifting uncomfortably, clearly embarrassed by her colleague's behavior. Marcus pulled out his driver's license, along with his company CEO card. Not that he needed to, but experience had taught him sometimes it helped. Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the CEO title, but her expression quickly hardened again. "These seem unusual," she said, drawing out the last word like a question. By now, the entire first-class cabin had gone quiet. A teenager in row 3 had started recording discreetly with his phone, while his father pretended not to notice. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a plastic airline knife. Marcus could feel his presentation notes on his tablet becoming background noise to this all-too-familiar scene. "Is there a problem?" asked the elderly gentleman with the Financial Times, finally breaking his silence. "I've been flying first class for 30 years, and I'd never seen anyone asked for this much documentation after boarding." His British accent carried authority, and several other passengers nodded in agreement. Sarah's face flushed red, but instead of backing down, she seemed to dig in deeper. "I'm just following protocol," she insisted, though everyone knew this wasn't standard procedure. She held Marcus's ID up to the light, examining it as if she were a customs agent investigating a suspicious passport. The young family's little girl, no more than 6 years old, suddenly piped up, "Mommy, why is the lady being mean to that man?" The question, innocent and honest, hung in the air like the last note of a song. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she continued her inspection. Marcus sat there, outwardly calm, but mentally counting his breaths, a technique he'd learned in his first year as CEO when dealing with difficult board members. The presentation he needed to review for his million-dollar meeting was still waiting on his tablet, but now all eyes in the cabin were focused on this unfolding drama. Just when it seemed the tension couldn't get any thicker, Sarah finally spoke again, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Well, everything appears to be in order. Now, what was it you wanted?" The way she said it made it clear this wasn't over. It was just the beginning of what would become a very long flight for everyone involved. The next 15 minutes on the flight felt like walking through a minefield. Marcus finally got his water. Sort of. Sarah approached with a water bottle and a plastic cup, her movements stiff and deliberate. The other passengers watched from the corners of their eyes, pretending to be absorbed in their various activities, but missing nothing. "Here's your water, sir," Sarah said, emphasizing the "sir" in a way that made it sound more like an insult than a courtesy. As she began pouring, her hands were steady, too steady, like someone trying very hard to appear professional while fighting inner tension. Marcus's laptop sat open on his tray table, displaying complex graphs and charts for his upcoming presentation. That's when it happened. The water stream accidentally veered off course, splashing not into the cup but directly onto his laptop's keyboard. Time seemed to freeze. Drops of water danced across the screen, seeping into the spaces between keys. Marcus's heart stopped as his screen flickered once, twice, then went black. "Oh my, I'm so terribly sorry," Sarah exclaimed, but her voice carried a note of satisfaction that everyone in the cabin caught. The smirk that flashed across her face for a split second was subtle but unmistakable. She dabbed at the laptop with a thin cocktail napkin, managing somehow to make even this gesture seem aggressive. The teenager who had been recording earlier hadn't stopped. His phone captured everything. The calculated accident, the smirk, the half-hearted attempt to help. His father, a marketing executive by the looks of his open laptop, nodded slightly at his son, understanding the importance of documenting the moment. Marcus sat there, watching 3 years of work, and tomorrow's crucial presentation potentially drain away with the water. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to dry the laptop, but he kept his face neutral. The old British gentleman from earlier wasn't so restrained. "This is absolutely outrageous," he declared, pressing his call button repeatedly. A younger flight attendant, Jenny, rushed over, her face pale as she took in the scene. "I'll get more napkins," she offered, shooting an apologetic look at Marcus. But Sarah stepped in front of her. "I've got this handled," she said firmly, still making the show of dabbing uselessly at the laptop with the same small napkin. The mother with the young children covered her daughter's eyes, not wanting her to see such blatant meanness. The business person across the aisle had stopped pretending to read his newspaper and was openly filming now. Someone in the back of first class muttered, "This is going straight to Twitter." Marcus finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "May I please have some paper towels from the galley?" The simple request seemed to catch Sarah off guard. Perhaps she had expected yelling, accusations, or a scene she could use to justify her behavior. Instead, she faced dignity and composure, and it seemed to unsettle her more than any angry outburst would have. Jenny returned with a stack of paper towels, kneeling beside Marcus's seat to help clean up, her kindness a stark contrast to her colleague's behavior. As they worked to dry the laptop, Sarah stood watching, her earlier satisfaction fading as she noticed more passengers pulling out their phones to record. "I'm sure it was just an accident," Marcus said loudly enough for everyone to hear, his words dripping with quiet significance. "These things happen all the time to certain people." The cabin fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Several passengers exchanged knowing looks. As Sarah finally retreated to the galley, Marcus pulled out his phone, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. The elderly British gentleman leaned forward. "Young man," he whispered, "I do hope you're doing what I think you're doing." Marcus nodded slightly, a small, determined smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The real story was about to begin, and Sarah had no idea what she had just set in motion. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Marcus's fingers moved swiftly across his phone's screen, his calm exterior masking the careful calculation behind each action. The laptop in front of him sat dead and dripping, a reminder of what had just transpired. But Marcus Chen hadn't built a successful tech company by letting setbacks defeat him. First, he opened his email. The airline's CEO, board members, and executive team were about to receive something unexpected in their inboxes. Within minutes, videos from 5 different passengers landed in his cloud drive, each showing Sarah's accident from various angles. The teenage boy who'd been recording even used AirDrop to share his perfectly captured footage of Sarah's telling smirk. "Excuse me," whispered Jenny, the kind flight attendant, slipping him a napkin. But this wasn't just any napkin. It had her employee number and a brief note. "I'll be your witness. This isn't right." Marcus smiled gratefully, adding this information to his growing documentation. The British gentleman, who had introduced himself as Professor James Cambridge from Oxford Business School, leaned over. "I've been consulting for airlines for 30 years, young man. What happened here today? It's a masterclass in what not to do in customer service. Would you mind if I used this as a case study for my students?" Marcus nodded, an idea forming. He opened LinkedIn on his phone and began typing. No rants, no angry accusations. Instead, he crafted a thoughtful post about unconscious bias in customer service. "Today, at 36,000 feet, I witnessed how a single moment can become a learning opportunity for corporate America," he began. The post was professional, measured, and powerful. As he typed, the businessman across the aisle, who turned out to be a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, watched with growing interest. "That's quite different from the usual angry social media callouts," he observed quietly. Marcus smiled. "Anger spreads fast, but burns out quickly. Real change needs a longer flame." His LinkedIn post continued. "As a CEO, I understand that our actions in difficult moments define our character more than our successes. Today's incident isn't just about one flight attendant's behavior. It's about the systems and training that either prevent or enable such interactions. The mother with the young children approached his seat. "My daughter wants you to have this," she said softly, handing him a crayon drawing. It showed a stick figure in a cape, with the words "Super Nice Man" written in purple. Marcus carefully tucked it into his jacket pocket, more touched by this simple gesture than he let show. Meanwhile, his phone started buzzing. The airline's executive team was responding already. They had seen the videos. The CEO's message was brief but clear. "Mr. Chen, please accept our deepest apologies. Would you be willing to discuss this with us upon landing? We need voices like yours to help us do better." Marcus glanced toward the galley where Sarah was hiding, avoiding the first-class cabin she'd been so eagerly policing earlier. She had no idea that her attempt to humiliate him was transforming into a watershed moment for corporate training and bias awareness. Opening his notes app, Marcus began outlining key points for his conversation with the airline's CEO. His original investor meeting might be in jeopardy due to the damaged laptop, but something equally important was taking shape. The teenager's father, a diversity officer at a Fortune 500 company, passed him a business card. "When you're ready to share this story more widely, call me. Companies need to hear this." As the flight continued, Marcus's phone kept lighting up with notifications. His LinkedIn post was going viral, being shared by business leaders and diversity advocates across industries. But he wasn't done yet. There was one more email to write, to Sarah's direct supervisors, not calling for her firing, but for something more meaningful, a chance to turn this incident into real, lasting change. The plane had 3 more hours until landing, and Marcus was about to show everyone on board what real leadership looked like in the face of discrimination. Sometimes, he typed in a text to his board of directors, "Your biggest presentations aren't the ones you planned for." The plane hadn't even landed when the airline's damage control machine roared into action. Marcus's phone buzzed continuously as notifications flooded in. His LinkedIn post had exploded, reaching over 100,000 views in just 2 hours. CEOs, diversity experts, and major news outlets were all sharing the story, but it was the airline CEO's response that caught everyone's attention. David Thompson, the airline's chief executive, didn't hide behind a PR team. Instead, he posted a direct video response. "I just watched the footage of what happened on Flight 2387. To Mr. Chen and every passenger who has ever faced similar treatment, I am deeply sorry. We're not going to bury this incident. We're going to learn from it." In first class, passengers were still sharing videos and discussing the incident. The Wall Street Journal reporter was already writing his story on his phone. Tech CEO's response to discrimination goes viral and changes corporate America's conversation. Sarah had been quietly replaced by Jenny for the remainder of the flight, retreating to economy class service. Marcus's inbox filled with messages. A producer from Good Morning America wanted him for tomorrow's show. Harvard Business Review requested an article about transforming negative experiences into leadership moments. But the message that really caught his attention came from a flight attendant support group. "What happened today happens more often than anyone admits. We need your help to change the training system." The plane hit some turbulence, a fitting metaphor for the storm brewing in the airline's corporate offices. Marcus overheard Jenny on her phone in the galley. "Yes, sir. Mr. Thompson wants all senior staff in an emergency meeting the moment we land." Her voice carried a mix of worry and hope. The elderly British professor showed Marcus his phone. #FirstClassWhileBlack was trending on Twitter, with thousands sharing similar experiences. But unlike typical viral outrage, the conversation was different. People were sharing Marcus's LinkedIn post and discussing solutions, not just problems. A flight attendant from economy class sneaked forward to whisper to Marcus, "Thank you. Sarah's been doing this for years, but nobody knew how to stop it. Some of us tried reporting it, but..." She trailed off as her eyes welled up. Marcus made a note in his phone. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. The airline's PR team released their third statement in as many hours. Effective immediately, all 47,000 of our employees will undergo enhanced bias training. Mr. Chen has been invited to help reshape our customer service policies. Comments flooded in. Other airlines were taking notes. Sarah, now visible at the back of the plane, looked shell-shocked. The smirk was long gone, replaced by the dawning realization that her actions had triggered a corporate earthquake. Several passengers who had filmed the incident were now being contacted by the airline's legal team, their videos becoming part of the company's new training materials. Marcus received another email, this time from his investors. Saw what happened. Don't worry about the meeting. We're rescheduling. This is more important. Also, we're doubling our planned investment. Leaders like you are rare. He smiled, remembering his ruined laptop. Sometimes losing a presentation leads to presenting something far more valuable. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. Also, there was a pause. Mr. Chen, our CEO would like to personally meet you at the gate. Several passengers applauded. The young girl who had drawn him the picture whispered loudly to her mother. See, the good guy wins. As the plane descended toward San Francisco, Marcus looked out the window at the city below. His phone showed 204 unread messages, trending hashtags, and viral posts. But what he saw was bigger than social media buzz. It was the rare moment when a negative experience could spark genuine change. Jenny approached one last time with a fresh cup of water, placed carefully on his tray. They're saying this will change everything, she said quietly. Marcus nodded, thinking of all the other passengers who had faced similar treatment. Change, he replied, starts at 36,000 feet today. The scene at San Francisco International Airport's gate, a 7 looked more like a press conference than a flight arrival. Television crews had somehow gotten wind of the story, their cameras ready as passengers began deplaning. But what happened next surprised everyone. Marcus was the last to leave the aircraft, not out of fear or hesitation, but because he'd spent those extra minutes talking to Jenny about her experiences. As he stepped into the terminal, he saw Sarah standing with the airline's executives, her eyes red from crying, her uniform still crisp, but her confidence shattered. David Thompson, the airline's CEO, stepped forward to shake Marcus's hand, but Marcus held up a finger. One moment, please. He walked directly to Sarah, whose body tensed as if preparing for public humiliation. Instead, Marcus spoke softly. Would you be willing to have a conversation? Not about punishment, but about understanding. The cameras rolled, reporters leaned in with their microphones, but Marcus gestured them back. This wasn't meant to be a spectacle. The airline's executive team watched, puzzled, as Marcus led Sarah to a quiet corner of the terminal. Professor Cambridge, who had waited to witness this moment, nodded approvingly. Tell me about your worst day at work, Marcus began, surprising Sarah. Not today. Before this, tell me what made you fear or distrust passengers. Slowly, hesitantly, Sarah began to talk. She spoke about aggressive passengers, about feeling unprotected by management, about how fear had turned to bias, bias to judgment, and judgment to actions she now regretted deeply. The airline's head of training scribbled notes furiously. This wasn't the expected punishment narrative. It was something far more valuable. Marcus listened, asked questions, and shared his own experiences of being judged, not as accusations but as bridges to understanding. I could call for your firing, Marcus said, loud enough for nearby executives to hear. But what would that solve? Instead, I have a different proposal. He turned to the airline's CEO. What if Sarah became part of the solution? The executives exchanged glances, intrigued. Marcus outlined his vision. A complete overhaul of the airline's training program, with Sarah and other flight attendants sharing real experiences. We need to address the root causes: stress, fear, implicit bias, not just the symptoms. The head of HR was already nodding enthusiastically. Sarah's hands trembled as she wiped her eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you give me this chance after what I did?" Marcus smiled, remembering his early days as a CEO, when his own mistakes had taught him the most valuable lessons. Because change doesn't come from punishment, it comes from transformation. The young girl from the flight tugged at Marcus's sleeve, her mother apologizing for the interruption. "Did you make the mean lady nice?" she asked innocently. Sarah knelt down, meeting the child's eyes. "No, sweetie. He gave me a chance to learn how to be nice again." Reporters surrounding them frantically took notes. This wasn't the angry confrontation they'd expected to film. Instead, they were witnessing a masterclass in leadership and human dignity. The Wall Street Journal reporter's fingers flew across his phone. Breaking. Corporate America gets lesson in transformative justice at 36,000 feet. The airline's CEO stepped forward again, this time addressing both Marcus and Sarah. "We're announcing a new initiative today. Sky High Standards, a comprehensive program to address bias in air travel. And we'd like both of you to help lead it." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. Jenny, who had waited to clock out, watched with tears in her eyes as her colleague began the journey from being part of the problem to becoming part of the solution. Other flight attendants gathered, witnessing a moment that would change their industry's approach to bias and customer service forever. As the crowd began to disperse, Professor Cambridge approached Marcus one last time. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been teaching business leadership for 30 years. But today, young man, you taught me something new." Marcus smiled, checking his phone to find 347 new emails. The real work was just beginning. The scene at San Francisco International Airport's gate, a 7 looked more like a press conference than a flight arrival. Television crews had somehow gotten wind of the story, their cameras ready as passengers began deplaning. But what happened next surprised everyone. Marcus was the last to leave the aircraft, not out of fear or hesitation, but because he'd spent those extra minutes talking to Jenny about her experiences. As he stepped into the terminal, he saw Sarah standing with the airline's executives, her eyes red from crying, her uniform still crisp, but her confidence shattered. David Thompson, the airline's CEO, stepped forward to shake Marcus's hand, but Marcus held up a finger. "One moment, please." He walked directly to Sarah, whose body tensed as if preparing for public humiliation. Instead, Marcus spoke softly. "Would you be willing to have a conversation? Not about punishment, but about understanding." The cameras rolled. Reporters leaned in with their microphones, but Marcus gestured them back. This wasn't meant to be a spectacle. The airline's executive team watched, puzzled, as Marcus led Sarah to a quiet corner of the terminal. Professor Cambridge, who had waited to witness this moment, nodded approvingly. "Tell me about your worst day at work," Marcus began, surprising Sarah. "Not today. Before this. Tell me what made you fear or distrust passengers." Slowly, hesitantly, Sarah began to talk. She spoke about aggressive passengers, about feeling unprotected by management, about how fear had turned to bias, bias to judgment, and judgment to actions she now regretted deeply. The airline's head of training scribbled notes furiously. This wasn't the expected punishment narrative. It was something far more valuable. Marcus listened, asked questions, and shared his own experiences of being judged, not as accusations, but as bridges to understanding. "I could call for your firing," Marcus said, loud enough for nearby executives to hear. But what would that solve? "Instead, I have a different proposal." He turned to the airline's CEO. "What if Sarah became part of the solution?" The executives exchanged glances, intrigued. Marcus outlined his vision. The complete overhaul of the airline's training program, with Sarah and other flight attendants sharing real experiences. "We need to address the root causes: stress, fear, implicit bias, not just the symptoms." The head of HR was already nodding enthusiastically. Sarah's hands trembled as she wiped her eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you give me this chance after what I did?" Marcus smiled, remembering his early days as a CEO, when his own mistakes had taught him the most valuable lessons. Because change doesn't come from punishment, it comes from transformation. The young girl from the flight tugged at Marcus's sleeve, her mother apologizing for the interruption. "Did you make the mean lady nice?" she asked innocently. Sarah knelt down, meeting the child's eyes. "No, sweetie. He gave me a chance to learn how to be nice again." Reporters surrounding them frantically took notes. This wasn't the angry confrontation they'd expected to film. Instead, they were witnessing a masterclass in leadership and human dignity. The Wall Street Journal reporter's fingers flew across his phone. Breaking. Corporate America gets lesson in transformative justice at 36,000 feet. The airline's CEO stepped forward again, this time addressing both Marcus and Sarah. "We're announcing a new initiative today. Sky High Standards, a comprehensive program to address bias in air travel. And we'd like both of you to help lead it." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. Jenny, who had waited to clock out, watched with tears in her eyes as her colleague began the journey from being part of the problem to becoming part of the solution. Other flight attendants gathered, witnessing a moment that would change their industry's approach to bias and customer service forever. As the crowd began to disperse, Professor Cambridge approached Marcus one last time. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been teaching business leadership for 30 years. But today, young man, you taught me something new." Marcus smiled, checking his phone to find 347 new emails. The real work was just beginning.